Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are focusing on an age bracket that is arguably one of the most dynamic periods, but it's kind of hiding behind this facade of normalcy.
Right.
We're taking a deep dive into middle childhood. So we're talking roughly the years spanning from age 6 through 10.
That sort of sweet spot, right.
Exactly. It's that zone right after the rapid chaos of toddlerhood and just before the big dramatic upheaval of adolescence. It's a time of profound, if subtle, reorganization.
It's a vital period, and you're right. Historically, it's been underestimated because the changes aren't as visibly dramatic as what you see in infancy or puberty.
And so what are we working with today?
We have a really substantial amount of source material. It covers, everything from specific physiological benchmarks all the way to the labyrinthine complexity of brain measurement and educational frameworks.
And our mission for this deep dive.
I think our goal is to synthesize the critical insights. We want to look at biosocial development, how we truly measure intelligence and potential, and the growing, often controversial complexities of educational needs, specifically in this age group.
So you, the listener, walk away understanding the unseen forces shaping children's lives during these really formative years.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away with something that should be, I think, a universal source of relief for parents and public health officials everywhere. Our sources universally identify middle childhood, that 6 to 10 window, as the single healthiest period of the entire human lifespan.
That finding is so robust and honestly fascinating. Statistically, these are the safest, most biologically stable years of your life.
Safer than any other time.
By far. Fatal diseases are extremely rare. And when you look at accidental injury rates, they are significantly lower than in infancy or, later in adolescence.
Why is that?
Well, the physical structure is largely mature enough to handle minor setbacks, yet the child isn't yet exposed to the elevated risks that come with teenage behaviors.
So this protection, it's not just a lull between developmental storms.
Well, not at all.
Our material suggests it's a culmination of protective factors. We're looking at inherent genetic resistance, environmental controls that families have established.
And huge public health successes.
Yeah.
Things like education, immunization programs, improved sanitation. All of these things form what you could call a comprehensive biosocial shield around the child.
A biosocial shield. I like that.
Exactly. And inside that protective bubble, we see this crucial phase of physical development that's defined by slower overall growth, but significantly greater strength.
So they're not shooting up in height like they were before.
No, the growth charts start to level off a bit.
Yeah.
And that frees up biological resources for internal strengthening.
Okay, so what does that internal strengthening actually look like? This is where it gets really interesting for me.
Physically, their body systems are just maximizing efficiency.
How so?
Well, their muscles are growing denser, not just bigger. Their hearts and lungs are increasing in capacity, which means they can sustain activity for much longer periods.
So they can run faster, their endurance just shoots up.
Dramatically. Their coordination sharpens. They reach a developmental peak where they can technically master almost any motor skill that doesn't strictly require the size or the hormonal profile of an adult body.
Give me an example.
Think about the intricate footwork in soccer, or complex gymnastics routines, or playing an instrument that requires really precise movements. Their brains are wired and ready to learn those sequences, and their bodies finally have the strength and control to execute them.
And this physical capability, it has long-term implications that go way beyond the playground. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Our sources really emphasize that the health habits established between 6 and 10, and these are influenced so heavily by both peers and parental modeling, they have a profound lifelong impact on adult health.
So this is the critical window.
This is the window for solidifying routines around nutrition, activity, sleep, you name it. If we fail to establish those routines now, we are, in essence, setting that individual up for a lifetime of fighting against deeply ingrained patterns.
It's an investment.
A huge investment in their future vascular health, their metabolic stability, even their psychological well-being.
And on a very specific structural level, we noted the importance of oral health during this phase. Why is that specific detail highlighted so much?
Because it's a huge, visible, physiological marker of this age range. This is when the majority of their permanent teeth are erupting.
The ones they have to live with for the rest of their lives.
For the next 70 or 80 years, exactly. So
Yeah.
proper dental hygiene, diet, consistent care during this period. It's just non-negotiable for future health. It's one of those milestones that really anchors middle childhood in physical terms.
Okay, so moving directly into how that strength gets used, we have to discuss the crucial role of physical activity. And let's unpack this because active play is often seen just as an antidote to obesity.
Right, that's the main headline.
But the benefits documented in our research are so much more encompassing.
They certainly are. Beyond just contributing to better physical health and reducing obesity rates, active play, especially in a social context, provides huge cognitive and social benefits.
Like what?
It demonstrably improves problem-solving ability.
Wow.
Well, think about it. Navigating a complex physical environment, like a game of tag or building a fort, requires real-time executive function and adaptation. You have to think on your feet.
And what's fascinating here is the social contribution. The sources emphasize that active cooperative play is this powerful engine for teaching things like cooperation and fairness.
And respect. The critical skill of respecting teammates and opponents, regardless of their backgrounds, their ethnicities, their nationalities.
You are watching social cohesion being built in real time on the playground.
That's a perfect way to put it. When a child learns to accept a referee's call they don't like, or has to strategize with a peer they normally wouldn't talk to, they are internalizing lessons about civic life and shared goals that are, they're just fundamentally important to functioning in a diverse society.
That sounds ideal, but the data quickly introduces some pretty stark real-world disparities.
Yeah.
Activity levels vary drastically.
They do, by culture and by socioeconomic status.
Can you elaborate on the cultural examples we found?
Yes, the contrast is really stark. We looked at examples like schools in Japan, where there's a much more intentional, integrated emphasis on physical activity.
It's built into the system.
It's built right into the standard school structure and curriculum. They often have robust facilities, swimming pools, multiple indoor gyms, outdoor climbing structures. It reflects a cultural perspective that physical development is foundational, not just an optional extra.
So let's contrast that integrated approach with the systemic disparities we see here. Our sources highlight that children from low SES families or those with physical disabilities are consistently the least likely to be included in those kinds of private, organized physical programs.
And that creates a severe equity issue. The very children who might benefit most from the discipline, the structure, and the cooperative lessons of organized sports are the ones who are often excluded.
Because of cost or transportation?
Or just a lack of accessible facilities in their neighborhoods.
This exclusion isn't just a matter of fairness. It seems to have measurable academic consequences. There was a study of elementary schools in Illinois that found a really troubling correlation.
That correlation is highly significant, and it demands attention. The study found that the schools with the least time allocated for physical activity also tended to have the greatest proportion of low SES children, and they also exhibited the lowest reading scores.
Wow.
Now, we always have to say that correlation isn't direct causation. Perhaps these schools are also just resource poor in general, but it strongly suggests that denying children physical development time may be exacerbating existing educational inequalities.
The mind and body are just too linked to separate their needs.
You can't separate them. It's a very strong argument against cutting gym class to try and boost test scores.
So let's zoom in on the specific physical changes themselves, the maturation of motor skills. We usually divide these into gross motor skills and fine motor skills.
Right. Gross motor skills are your large, whole-body movements, running, hopping, throwing a ball. Those are largely refined by the time a child hits middle childhood.
But fine motor skills?
Fine motor skills, however, are the small, controlled movements. The precision required for writing, using scissors, or, crucially, the eye control necessary for tracking lines of text while reading. Those are still developing.
And here's a small developmental detail that often surprises people, but it has huge implications for early schooling.
Yes, the gender difference.
Fine motor skills generally mature about 6 months earlier in girls than in boys.
And that 6-month difference can be a major factor in those early elementary classrooms, where tasks like handwriting and detailed drawing are really emphasized.
So a boy entering first grade might genuinely be 6 months behind his female peers,
In the neurological development required for those fine control tasks.
which can lead to early frustration or even labeling.
Exactly. Understanding this biological difference allows educators and parents to be more patient and, maybe provide alternative ways for them to express themselves.
We also saw a recent trend toward more parental involvement in physical activity, which is generally a good thing.
It is. It's beneficial.
But as you mentioned, this increased focus, especially in competitive sports, can sometimes affect the adult's emotions.
Yes. While encouragement is great, the sources do note that adult emotional investment in competitive children's sports can, well, it can sometimes turn toxic.
The parent on the sideline.
The parent projecting their own competitive desires or frustrations onto a 9-year-old soccer game, it's just counterproductive. The focus of middle childhood activity should always remain on skill development, cooperation, and the intrinsic enjoyment of the game.
Not parental validation.
Definitely not parental validation.
So while we celebrate middle childhood as this age of peak health, we have to pivot now to the significant chronic health challenges that can complicate this period.
Right. The things that interfere with school, play, and friendship.
We're in this phase where lifetime health habits are being solidified, and the social context of the child, their environment, their diet, their stress level, it all profoundly interacts with both physical and psychological conditions.
And our sources focus extensively on two major chronic conditions, the obesity epidemic and the rising prevalence of asthma.
Let's start with obesity, because the numbers are truly alarming. More than 20% of U.S. children in middle childhood are currently classified as obese.
And the recent data shows a distinct acceleration of this crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a really stark natural experiment.
How so?
Well, due to widespread school closures, reduced organized activity, and massively increased sedentary screen time, obesity rates went up across nearly every age group in 2020.
But the data confirms the largest increases.
We're seeing specifically in middle childhood, it just underlines their specific vulnerability to disruptions in routine and physical structure.
So to make sure we're using the right definitions, we need to clarify how overweight and obesity are defined using the body mass index, or BMI.
It's a calculation, a ratio of weight to height. For children, though, unlike for adults, the definition isn't a fixed number. It's based on percentiles relative to other children of the same age and sex.
So what are the cutoffs?
Childhood overweight is defined as a BMI above the 85th percentile, so the child weighs more than 85% of their peers.
And childhood obesity.
That's defined as a BMI above the 95th percentile.
And the difference between the 85th and 95th is significant.
Very. A child above the 85th is struggling with weight, but a child above the 95th is entering a dangerous territory that carries much higher risks for chronic illness down the road.
And here is the so what that is just staggering. It illustrates the massive scale of this global shift.
It's a shocking statistic. Obesity now causes more deaths worldwide than malnutrition.
Let me just repeat that. More deaths from obesity than from malnutrition.
We have completely flipped the primary global health concern from scarcity to overabundance and a sedentary lifestyle.
That is a fundamental societal shift in human health.
It is, and the physical correlations are crystal clear. Childhood overweight correlates strongly with immediate health concerns like high blood pressure, sleep apnea, certain types of asthma, and elevated cholesterol. It is not just a cosmetic issue.
It's a metabolic one.
A metabolic one that promises a very difficult adult life.
On the behavioral front, our sources introduced this concept of pester power.
Ah, yes, pester power.
This is the highly effective, persistent urging by children for specific foods, treats, or toys. We've all seen it. How does this factor into weight gain?
Pester power works because parents are busy, they're tired, and they often just succumb to the constant pressure to maintain peace.
Been there.
Right. And this undermines consistent efforts to establish healthy eating routines. If a parent repeatedly buys a highly processed snack food because of a public tantrum, that snack just becomes part of the family's entrenched habit.
It shows how systemic pressure, like marketing, collides directly with family health goals.
It's a direct collision.
Okay, let's shift to the second major chronic condition, asthma. This is a chronic inflammatory disorder of the airways.
The airways swell and narrow, making breathing difficult. It's highly complex, driven by an interplay of genetics and environment.
The triggers can be anything from pet dander and mold indoors to ozone and pollutants outdoors.
And that environmental link leads us directly to a key piece of research called the hygiene hypothesis.
This raises a really important question about our modern way of living. Can you clarify how this hypothesis tries to explain the rise of allergic diseases like asthma?
Certainly. The hygiene hypothesis basically posits that our modern standards of extreme cleanliness and sanitation, they decrease a child's early exposure to a diverse range of microbes, bacteria, viruses, parasites, things that were common in previous generations. So the immune system, which is supposed to learn during early childhood what's dangerous and what's harmless, is essentially deprived of its training period.
So if the immune system isn't trained on genuine threats, what does it start doing?
It starts to overreact to harmless substances. Lacking that appropriate microbial input, the immune system targets benign agents like pollen or dust or certain foods.
And that results in allergic diseases.
Food allergies, eczema, and significantly asthma. It's the paradox of progress. Our successful fight against infectious disease might inadvertently be contributing to a higher prevalence of autoimmune and allergic disorders.
That's a fascinating synthesis. Okay, now we move from the robust body to the reorganizing brain. Let's talk about embodied cognition.
Embodied cognition is the understanding that the body and its movements are integral to cognitive function. They aren't separate.
And in middle childhood, this connection becomes extremely apparent.
Movement actively improves intellectual functioning.
What's the mechanism there?
Oh.
How does physical activity literally make you smarter?
It's primarily through neurochemical and circulatory improvements. Vigorous activity increases cerebral blood flow, delivering more oxygen and glucose to the brain.
Okay.
It also stimulates the release of key neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, which are vital for attention, mood regulation, and memory.
And that physical benefit translates directly into observable cognitive improvements, particularly in what we call executive control.
Yes. We see better selective attention, the ability to focus on one thing while filtering out background noise, and significantly faster reaction times.
A well-oiled body facilitates an efficient mind. Shifting now to how we quantify that intellectual sharpness, we have to distinguish between measuring potential and measuring actual knowledge. Aptitude versus achievement.
Right. Aptitude tests, like the classic IQ test, try to measure the potential to master a skill or a body of knowledge. They ask, what is your capacity for learning?
Whereas achievement tests,
They measure mastery, they measure proficiency in a specific subject you've already learned, like geometry or reading comprehension.
can you just remind us of the original calculation for IQ?
Sure. The intelligence quotient was originally defined as mental age divided by chronological age times 100.
So a 10-year-old performing at the level of a 12-year-old has an IQ of 120.
Correct. But that model, while foundational, quickly ran into limitations as people aged.
What's fascinating here, and highly relevant to this generation of kids, is the Flynn effect.
The Flynn effect is a huge, documented historical trend. It's the observed rise in average IQ scores that has occurred consistently over decades in many nations around the world.
So the average person today would score significantly higher on an IQ test from, say, 50 years ago.
Much higher.
Why does this happen? Are we just getting smarter?
That is the big debate. Most researchers don't think it's an increase in innate biological potential. They attribute it to massive environmental improvements. Better nutrition, which means healthier brain development, more complex and prolonged formal schooling, and crucially, a cultural shift towards abstract, logical problem-solving that's just. It's everywhere in our environment and media.
So we're constantly being trained to think in the way these tests measure.
We are constantly being exposed to complex information and abstract concepts that require analytical thought.
The Flynn effect suggests that these tests have to be constantly renormed, or the entire population would start to look gifted.
Exactly. And this brings us to the realization that a single score couldn't possibly capture the full picture of intelligence.
Which leads to theories of multiple intelligences.
Absolutely. The move away from that monolithic IQ score was a necessary and important step. Our sources detailed two key frameworks here, Sternberg's 3 and Gardner's 9.
Okay, let's start with Sternberg's framework. He proposed a triarchic theory: academic, creative, and practical intelligence.
Academic intelligence is your classic school smarts, analysis, planning, what IQ tests measure. Creative intelligence is the capacity to deal with new situations, to generate novel solutions, to think outside the box.
And practical intelligence.
That's your street smarts. The ability to apply knowledge to real-world contexts, manage yourself, and navigate social situations effectively.
It sounds appealing, but our sources did offer a word of caution about applying this model.
Yes, the caution is that while the theory is conceptually sound, trying to perfectly match instructional styles to these three types, well, it hasn't always been fully supported by the scientific research in educational settings.
It's a good guide, but not a rigid rule.
A great theoretical guide, but it has to be applied flexibly.
Now, contrast that with Gardner's framework, which has deeply influenced modern education. He proposed 9 distinct types of intelligence.
Gardner's original 7 included linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal.
Which is understanding others.
Right? And intrapersonal, which is understanding yourself.
And he added 2 more later.
Yes. He later added naturalistic understanding, nature and classifications, and spiritual or existential intelligence. The power of this model is that it recognizes that a child might be profoundly limited linguistically, but show extraordinary musical or spatial intelligence.
And the education system really seized on this because Gardner tried to associate each of these intelligences with distinct regions in the brain.
Yes. It gave educators a concrete rationale to diversify their teaching methods. To use music or movement, for instance, to reach students whose primary intelligence pathways weren't the traditional ones favored in standard curricula.
So to ground this in the hard data, let's look at neuroscience and brain scans. But our material suggests the relationship between what we see on a scan and what we see on a test isn't a simple equation.
No, it's very complex territory, and the interpretation is far from straightforward. Neurological measures like brain volume or activity patterns from an fMRI, they don't necessarily correlate perfectly with a written IQ score.
How can that be?
Well, for instance, heightened activity in a brain region could signal higher processing power. Or it could simply mean the brain is working much harder to accomplish a basic task because it's inefficient or there's a disorder.
So more brain activity isn't always better.
Not necessarily. We can see unusual brain patterns in children with disorders, but connecting that to a specific cognitive outcome requires great care and a lot of contextual understanding.
But the takeaways from neuroscientists, despite the complexity, are still critical for understanding middle childhood.
There are 3 key conclusions. First, brain development is highly dependent on specific experience. What a child is exposed to literally shapes their neural pathways.
Use it or lose it.
To an extent, yes. Second, brain development isn't finished in childhood. It continues throughout life, well into the mid-20s.
And third,
children with developmental disorders, like the ones we're about to discuss, frequently exhibit these unusual brain patterns, which at least offers a foundation for biological intervention and understanding.
that sets the perfect stage for our next topic. If brain patterns can be unusual, how do we distinguish between an unusual pattern and an actual disorder?
And that brings us into the necessary framework of developmental psychopathology.
Which is what exactly?
It's a field that links the study of typical developmental trajectories with the study of disorders. It acknowledges that development isn't a discrete series of stages, but a spectrum.
And this framework operates on several general principles that are crucial for parents and educators to grasp. What are the core 4?
The first is that abnormality is normal. Every single child will demonstrate behaviors that might look abnormal at some point: a severe tantrum, a brief obsession, temporary anxiety. It's the persistence and severity that define a problem.
Okay, what's the second?
Second, disability changes year by year. A condition that makes a 7-year-old highly impaired in a structured classroom might be much more manageable for a 10-year-old who has better coping skills and maturity.
And the third and fourth principles, they offer important long-term perspectives.
Third, life may be better or worse in adulthood. A childhood disorder is not a fixed destiny. And fourth, and this is maybe the most reflective of a social lens, diagnosis and treatment reflect the social context.
What does that mean?
Societal expectations about compliance or stillness or academic performance. Those expectations dictate which behaviors get labeled as problematic.
And why does middle childhood specifically make these disorders so much more visible?
Because of the context we just mentioned, age grouping and scheduled learning. Suddenly, a child is put in a classroom with 25 peers of the exact same chronological age, all expected to sit, focus, and perform specific tasks.
That forced comparison.
It dramatically reveals differences in attention, impulse control, and learning style that were less obvious in the more fluid structure of early childhood.
This framework also requires caution, emphasizing 2 principles: multifinality and equifinality.
These are essential for critical thinking about diagnosis.
Let's define them. Multifinality.
Multifinality means that one single cause can lead to many possible outcomes. For example, severe childhood trauma, one cause, could result in anxiety or depression or a learning disability or even high academic achievement as a coping mechanism. Many outcomes.
And the opposite of that is equifinality.
Exactly. Equifinality means many different causes can lead to one single outcome.
Can you give us a practical example of that?
Sure. Take the outcome of high inattentiveness in the classroom. That single behavior could stem from poor nutrition, severe family stress, an undiagnosed hearing problem, an actual neurological deficit like ADHD, or just profound boredom.
So many causes, one outcome.
Right. So because the surface behavior looks the same, we have to be extremely cautious in just attributing a single cause or applying a one-size-fits-all treatment.
That distinction really underscores the complexity of diagnosis. It's so difficult to distinguish between typical childish behavior and actual pathology.
Indeed. And our sources suggest a complex history with diagnostic manuals like the DSM. Some conditions might have been underdiagnosed in earlier versions.
But now the concern is the opposite.
Now, there's a genuine concern that, due to societal pressures and pharmaceutical marketing, some behaviors are potentially being overdiagnosed in the DSM-5.
We also have to ask if the problem is neurological immaturity.
Or a permanent neurological deficit. Is it that the brain simply needs more time to develop inhibitory control? That's a huge question.
Let's focus on the disorders that are most prominent during these years, starting with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
ADHD is characterized by a persistent difficulty concentrating, combined with inattentiveness, impulsivity, and often being physically overactive. The child really struggles with the executive functions needed for planning and completing tasks.
The U.S. has long reported the highest rates, but our data shows that rates everywhere else are now rapidly rising. Why is that happening globally?
It's likely a combination of factors. Increasing awareness and better diagnostic training internationally, for one, but also the relentless globalization of education models that require conformity and stillness.
And maybe the globalization of our diagnostic criteria and marketing.
That's a major concern, yes.
Yeah.
The increasing pressure to medicalize what might just be non-compliant classroom behavior.
Which leads to the specific reasons for concern within the U.S. about ADHD diagnosis.
There are three major ones. First, the risk of misdiagnosis attributing issues like anxiety or trauma to ADHD. Second, the potential for drug abuse with stimulant medications. And third,
The big one.
the pathologizing of behaviors that, in a less demanding or less structured environment, would just be considered typical childhood energy, simply because they don't fit the demands of a desk-bound education system.
So when a diagnosis is confirmed, what are the recommended treatment approaches?
A multimodal approach is generally best. This includes behavioral training for the family and the child to learn coping mechanisms, along with specialized education support.
And medication?
For many, yes, medication is a primary component. Ritalin and well over 20 other psychoactive drugs are used to manage symptoms. It remains highly effective for many, but it carries all the controversies we just mentioned.
Okay. Moving beyond general behavioral issues, we have specific learning disorders. How are these defined? How are they distinct from an intellectual disability?
A specific learning disorder involves a marked deficit in a specific area of learning like reading, writing, or math that is not caused by a general intellectual disability or a physical disability like poor vision or an exceptionally stressful home. The deficit is localized.
And the DSM-5 streamlined these diagnoses.
Yes, it combined many into the overarching diagnosis of specific learning disorder.
Let's look at the neurological basis for the two most common examples, starting with dyslexia.
Absolutely. Dyslexia is an unusual and persistent difficulty with reading. Research overwhelmingly links this to neurological underdevelopment in the language processing centers of the brain. Specifically affecting what's called the phonological loop, the ability to connect sounds to symbols and rapidly process the components of words. It's a deficit in the brain's ability to automate reading.
And the second example, dyscalculia.
Dyscalculia is an unusual difficulty with math. It often shows up as problems understanding quantities, number sense, and basic arithmetic. And crucially, it's linked to a distinct part of the brain, typically in the parietal lobe, which handles spatial organization and number processing.
The fact that these are neurologically separable is important.
It's huge. It further supports the idea of multiple specific neural pathways for learning.
Finally, in this section, we address autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. How has the definition changed, and what is the scope of the spectrum?
The DSM-5 expanded the term to include a wide, continuous range covering mild, moderate, and severe categories. And the spectrum is, well, it's vast.
On one end.
At one end, you might have children who never speak, who avoid eye contact, and who engage in highly restrictive repetitive play for hours with a single object.
And at the other end of that spectrum.
We find individuals who are considered high-functioning. They often exhibit immense talent in highly specialized areas, like incredible memory for facts or patterns, but they still struggle profoundly with social reciprocity and interpreting nonverbal cues.
So if we look across the entire spectrum, from severe to high functioning, What is the critical defining common denominator?
The source material is very clear on this. Across the entire spectrum, social interaction is always impaired.
Always.
Always. This core deficit in reading and responding to social cues, understanding emotional nuance, and engaging in fluid reciprocal communication is a signature of ASD.
And when it comes to treatment, the sheer breadth of the spectrum seems to make a standard approach almost impossible.
It does. Many treatments exist, but none are universally successful. And this leads to deep, often emotionally charged disagreements among parents, medical professionals, and researchers.
What are the main approaches?
They include both biological interventions, sometimes medication for associated symptoms like anxiety, and intensive behavioral therapies, like ABA, which focus on developing social and communication skills.
This incredible complexity in diagnosis brings us to a powerful counter-framework, neurodiversity.
A critical challenge to the entire system of diagnosis and standardization.
The core idea is simple. The natural variation in human brains makes people diverse in their abilities and needs. These are variations, not flaws.
It's a necessary perspective. It's a logical extension of the criticism aimed at single-score measures like the IQ test. If intelligence is multiple, then neurological differences should be seen as normal.
And applied to ASD.
It often leads to intense criticism of treatments that focus on normalizing behaviors. The argument is that society should adapt to diverse ways of thinking rather than forcing conformity.
So how does the system, which is fundamentally built on standardization, attempt to manage and support this neurodiversity? It relies heavily on special education policies.
Right. The U.S. system uses three primary interconnected frameworks. First, the least restrictive environment, or LRE. Second, response to intervention, RTI. And third, the individual education plan, or IEP.
Let's break those down. What does LRE mandate in practice?
LRE requires that children with special needs be educated in the setting that is closest to the general education environment while still allowing them to thrive.
So maximum inclusion.
Maximum inclusion. A child is in a standard classroom for most of the day, only being pulled out for specific targeted instruction rather than being segregated in a separate classroom unless absolutely necessary.
Then we have response to intervention, RTI, which is a tiered approach.
RTI is a pre-referral process designed to prevent the wait-to-fail problem. It involves providing increasingly intensive levels of support to any student who is struggling.
How do the tiers work?
Tier 1 is just high-quality instruction for everyone. If a student struggles, they move to Tier 2 for targeted small group work. If they still struggle, Tier 3 involves intensive, individualized support, which often triggers the formal special ed evaluation.
And the final piece, the individual education plan, or IEP.
The IEP is the legally binding written document for a child identified with a disability. It details their performance, sets measurable annual goals, outlines the specific services they'll receive, and says how their progress will be measured.
How's the school accountable?
Accountable for providing that customized support.
Despite these comprehensive policies, our sources cite significant challenges, including the issue that the labels and policies change more quickly than the children themselves.
That instability is disruptive. And there are specific systemic gaps. For instance, in many places, a common issue like ADHD still doesn't have its own specific funding or categorical support.
So schools have to lump them into broader, often inadequate categories.
Like other health impairment, exactly.
Yeah, this leads directly to what our sources call the pervasive problem of late intervention. Diagnosis and support happening far too late, or not at all.
This is the practical failure of the system. For ADHD, that lack of a distinct category often results in the wait-to-fail approach we mentioned.
The child has to struggle significantly.
Will fall a year or two behind their peers before the evidence is strong enough to justify the intensive, expensive support measures in an IEP.
And that delayed support is particularly tragic during these highly plastic and formative years of middle childhood. We saw a similar problem with ASD diagnosis.
Yes. Early diagnosis of ASD, while improving, is still often delayed, especially for high-functioning girls whose social struggles might be masked by compliant behavior. But the younger the child, especially in this 6 to 10 window, the more plastic their brain is and the more effective early intervention can be. Systemic delays rob the child of crucial developmental time.
So, to synthesize the massive amount of ground we've covered, middle childhood, ages 6 to 10, represents this paradoxical stage.
It does.
It is defined by robust physical health, the peak years, but at the same time, it's a period of profound cognitive reorganization. Physical activity directly fuels intellectual growth, And we see this increasing complex recognition of distinct developmental needs.
We've seen the critical impact of physical and environmental factors, from the crisis of obesity to the hygiene hypothesis. We've highlighted the tension between traditional measurement, the single IQ score, and the neurological reality of neurodiversity and multiple intelligences.
And fundamentally, we've navigated the complex landscape of diagnosis for disorders like ADHD and ASD, where systems have to learn to distinguish between genuine pathology and simple neurological immaturity.
While also trying to provide timely, individualized support through frameworks like LRE and IEP, the central conflict remains. How do we structure a system that strives for high standards while simultaneously honoring the reality that human brains are inherently diverse?
The conversation has moved from fixing the child to questioning the environment.
Precisely.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've established definitively that brain development depends heavily on specific experience and that our educational systems rely on constantly evolving, often inadequate, diagnostic labels and policies. So, considering the core principle of neurodiversity, that differences in processing are normal variations, what specific structural responsibility does society have to fundamentally adapt its learning environments, its classroom expectations, and its assessment methods to accommodate the diverse range of human needs, rather than continually placing the entire burden of adaptation and normalization on the child?